Semi-final round of in this debate, I'd like to congratulate the 4 teams who have made it here. In the opening government, we have KDS 1. In opening opposition, we have CAU 1. Closing government, we have KU 2. And in closing opposition, we have ICU 1. My name is Zheng Bo, and I'm the chair of this round of debate. And with me, we have Lok, Kozo, Dohi, and Valerie as our panels. So on the motion today that...
Is aircon on?
It's turning. Okay. On the motion that this House believes that all countries must ratify binding targets in any international agreement on climate change, I would like to now call the Prime Minister to start the debate. Yeah.
Ladies and gentlemen, when you start to talk about climate change policies, you suddenly come out with argumentations like China have not ratified Kyoto Protocol, United States have not ratified Kyoto Protocol, therefore the climate change policy in international arena always fails. That will be the typical argumentation that will be presented by the opening opposition or closing opposition. Let's see how that works. Ladies and gentlemen, in today's society, we're going to have a Rio +20 next year in Brazil. And these policies, ladies and gentlemen, are stimulating a creation of a mechanism in which nations can engage to solve the issues regarding climate change. So before moving on to anything else in the substantive case of the opening government, let's move on directly to the definition that we want to set. First of all, ladies and gentlemen, every single nation existing in the world, if they participate into a regional level or international level of agreement, such as Kyoto Protocol, UNFCCC climate change conferences, or Rio +20, if there is any binding treaty that's been created within these conferences, nations should ratify it. And ratifying it means, ladies and gentlemen, basically binding targets that exist within these mechanisms are not only including the binding target of the amount of the carbon emission that they want to reduce, but at the same time they have a target for the policy settings. And these policy settings include a ground for a negotiation, ground for a debate, and at the same time they create the databases, as we have seen the cases of Kyoto Protocol and UNFCCC, where they create a clean developmental mechanisms where nations can bilaterally and multilaterally engage to make the negotiation and set the policies that can empower a nation's inter-domestic or multilateral level to set a climate change policies. So within this debate, ladies and gentlemen, we are not here to say that nations should have a binding target. Therefore, if they don't have a binding target, it's not going to be a policy where we punish these countries in these circumstances. Because punishment is actually harmful in these circumstances regarding environmental policies. Because first of all, it decreases the cooperation of a nation from the very beginning. It prevents the ratification to take place from the very start. Because there's uncertainty where nations may not be able to reach a consensus or make a target that they set by themselves. Because under the situation of the climate change, ladies and gentlemen, there's always the things that you cannot expect, right? There's something to hold the nature itself and the environment itself is something that you can never expect. So you never know how this target will be set. However, ladies and gentlemen, the reason why we want to set a clear target for the binding target at this international arena and international organization is that by setting a binding target, nations can formulate the policies which will be taking a step-by-step approach to solve the issues regarding climate at this moment. So let's move on to the constructive case of our side, ladies and gentlemen. First of all, we want to emphasize here is that climate change policies need a stronger cooperation. At this moment, ladies and gentlemen, nations are not ratifying this policy because they have a belief that this policy will be disadvantageous for themselves because if they don't meet the target that they set by themselves, it will be disastrous. However, ladies and gentlemen, this targeting itself is already taking place into a domestic manner, even if they don't ratify an international agreement. When we see the case of the United States and China, ladies and gentlemen, they have their own independent policy regarding climate change. They say they don't want to ratify Kyoto Protocol, and they say they don't want to ratify UNFCCC because they have their own sovereignty. However, ladies and gentlemen, the mechanism and the policy that they set by themselves is the policy that is similar to the Kyoto Protocol and policy that has been recommended by UNFCCC. Then why is it so important that they ratify an international treaty? First of all, ladies and gentlemen, by ratifying the international treaty, it is important that nations can have a cooperation when we talk about an environmental policy. Why is it so, ladies and gentlemen? When we talk about climate, it's not only about issues about one country. If one country makes a policy in regard to climate change, such as increasing taxation for certain kind of fields, so this increases and disturbs the economic activity of the other nations, since we have seen the cases where if the oil price increases, it influences many other nations in the other hand. So by ratifying this policy, nations ratifying this policy and creating a ground for engagement and cooperation within these nations, they can have a clear coherences and better understanding of how this climate change will influence other countries. So basically, since the climate change itself is not only influencing one country and influences the other country, it is important that we have a mutual agreement and universal consensus within what kind of steps that we're going to take. Because when one country makes a policy by themselves, rather than ratifying the international committee, international treaty, is that the problem that we are going to face is that first of all, the nations will influence other nations when the other nations don't know what kind of influence that they will get. The nations will domestically formulate the policy by themselves, so therefore we don't see a differentiation between international treaty and in terms of domestic manner. However, in international manner, by setting on all nations in participating here, the second benefit that we want to say that we were going to get is that nations may have better engagement in terms of cooperation and strengthens legitimacy, which I will further explain after getting NCN's-PY.
Okay, I'm really confused. What is the target? You are talking about the countries, or you are talking about the extent that you must increase the 10% or 12%?
Right, the binding target itself includes a lot of factors within this situation. If you see the case of Kyoto Protocol, we have three different criteria. We first have a thing targeting in regarding to the carbon emission trading. Second, we have a targeting regarding in terms of carbon reduction treaties. And second, we have targeting in terms of clean developmental mechanisms where nations can make a mutual consensus and mutual agreement. And in terms of formulating funding for developing nations, and at the same time provide a policy line for developing nations where they can actually have a certain kind of implementation with the help of developed countries. So moving on to the legitimacy of the international treaty at this moment. At this moment, ladies and gentlemen, nations are making a bilateral and multilateral treaty in terms of climate change rather than ratifying an international treaty. We don't see, first of all, we don't see the difference between the consequences that the nation itself will face in the domestic manner, because they can still do the same thing in the international arena. However, what happens in the international arena is that the legitimacy of the policy that international organization sets will be seriously harmful. And we sometimes have a blame from which will also come from the opening opposition or closing opposition that the Kyoto Protocol has failed because nations have not ratified. The reason why this kind of criticism are coming is that nations are not ratifying this policy. However, the misconception that they have is that these policies are already taking place into a domestic manner. So therefore, in order to first, we have to have coherent policies by strengthening this international organization, having a legitimacy in terms of providing policies. When we see the cases where nations are cooperating and taking universal measures by ratifying specific policy, it will be easier for us to have stronger mechanisms in terms of dealing with situations. The reason why Copenhagen round has failed a few years ago was the nations are not complying with the rules that they're saying, that rules by the international organization by saying that they have all these domestic kind of measures. But ladies and gentlemen, if they have a domestic kind of measures, why can't they have an international ratification? By having an international ratification, it will be easier to have a cooperative measures between nations, since the climate change itself and the climate policy needs a cooperation within this nation. One nation's policy directly influences other nations' policy. So therefore, we have to have a stronger negotiation in terms of compromising the policy that each nation are setting under this ground. Without this kind of procedure, ladies and gentlemen, nations not only face a serious disadvantages because they don't know what kind of policy that will be created by a specific nation, thus they will be influenced, and at the same time they can prevent this kind of disadvantage to happen from the very beginning by stating that we want to have a certain kind of ratification and agreement. So with all these reasons, ladies and gentlemen, the opening government is powerful proposal.
I thank the Prime Minister for his speech and I'd like to call on the
I'm so disappointed about the opening government's forward fulfillment about setting a very soft line without having any clear ideas. What is the forceful mechanism to recognize this serious problem? What is the clear solution on this matter? Although he mentioned about what is the way, the effective way to make international treaties, etc., we couldn't hear what is the urgency of the problem. Why do they have to? Making a forceful mechanism to unilaterally, all the nations should cooperate each other within a dense quite lack from the opening government. First, he mentioned, I'm going to rebut his cases. I'm going to move on to my cases. First, I'm going to talk about what is the national sovereignty, why it is actually directly related to that. And secondly, I'm going to talk about what is the immorality on this issue. And thirdly, what is actually only benefit to the rich, not benefit to the surrounded people or the very people who are poor in a developing nation at the end. So, rebuttal first. First, he talked about nations' cooperation and effectivity, and he talked about what is a clear cooperation and how can we achieve it. But we couldn't hear what is the meaning of selecting the target. We think that he said it's the various forms of forcefulness. We agree that we think that there's actually various forms of the forceful. We think that it's actually the nations actually cooperatively do this. It's not about the nations actually unilaterally to follow it. We think that we couldn't find any of the forceful units. We think that they interpreted in this way in a quite wrong way. And secondly, he talked about the international treaties, as he talked about in that argument. He talked about the domestic matter. It's quite interesting, right? Because he said that the other nation will domestically follow the matter and setting their own criteria. We think that it's actually status quo. Actually, we are actually going to argue for that. We think that the reason why China actually said that they're going to reduce hydrogen oxidized by 80% is that it's because 18% is that it's because nobody told China to force China to do that, but actually Chinese people or the people in the other nation feel the ownership to decide their criteria, to ownership to fix this urgency. We think that is why actually status quo is working fine. We think that nations, if they understand what is the urgency of the problem, if the other nation try to persuade them through the subsidies, etc. We think that as they said, in a domestic manner, without having any forceful mechanism, we are going to solve this problem. So our model is that we think that we are going to make a persuasion, and we think that the other nation actually cooperatively subsidize each other. We think that, but at the end, the decision making should be done by the nation. We think that there is an ownership should be guaranteed to that nation. That is the thing I'm going to prove in my argumentation. First, now I'm going to talk about nation sovereignty. We think that there is a criteria when can we violate the nation sovereignty or not. We think that first, if it is very uncertainty manner. It's a very uncertainty harm which will be